Welcome to our explainer. Today we are diving deep into a really dramatic story from the Quran's Surah Al-Baqarah. It's a narrative that's got everything: divine revelation, human weakness, and a pretty shocking turn towards the forbidden.
So this brings up a fascinating question, right? How does a sacred text grapple with this idea that a community could be given divine law, the ultimate guidance, and then just trade it all for sorcery? That's the core tension we're going to unpack.
All right, so let's start at the beginning. We're going to look at this as a story of lost faith, focusing on a specific passage from verses 75 to 103. This part really sets the stage for everything that comes after.
To really get what's going on, we need a little context. The source explains that these verses were originally speaking to the early Muslim community. It's basically telling them, hey, don't be shocked if some tribes in Medina reject this message. The text frames this moment not as a one-off event, but as part of a much, much longer story.
And that long story is all built around this one central theme: a broken covenant. The whole narrative we're about to walk through is presented as a case study in what happens when that sacred trust between God and a people gets broken, again and again. You could say this idea of a broken promise is the engine driving this entire story.
So where does this pattern of broken trust even begin? Well, it starts with a very serious accusation: the deliberate twisting of the holy word itself.
And the accusation is pretty stark. The command was simple: hear the words of Allah. But according to the text, what a group among them would do is listen, fully understand the meaning, and then knowingly distort it. And that's the key here. The source is saying this wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a conscious choice.
So why would they do that? What was the motive? Well, according to the text, it was all about trading God's revelation for a small price. You know, things like money, social status, or a bit of power. The point the narrative is making is that eternal guidance was basically being sold off for short-term worldly stuff.
And the condemnation for this act, it is incredibly strong, as you can see from this verse. It's literally a curse on anyone who would just make up scripture with their own hands and then have the audacity to claim it's from God. In the eyes of the text, this is about as bad as it gets.
This leads us right into the next major theme: the specific pacts or covenants that were made and, according to the narrative, were completely shattered.
Now, the covenant itself was built on some pretty foundational principles. Worship one God, be good to the vulnerable, parents, orphans, the poor, and just generally speak kindly to people. These were the core rules of the sacred pact.
But after laying out those clear, simple commands, the source hits you with this really stark, impactful line: the pact was broken.
And we're not talking about small infractions here. The text alleges it was broken in the most extreme ways, like a pattern of rejecting the messengers sent to them, including Isa or Jesus, and the message of the Quran. It even makes the incredibly severe accusation that they killed their own prophets and just turned their backs on the very principles of justice they were supposed to uphold.
And this brings us to the climax of the whole story. Because after turning from scripture and from prophets, the narrative says they turned towards something else entirely: sorcery and forbidden knowledge.
The way the narrative sets the stage is with a really shocking accusation. It claims that some people started following what devils were teaching them. And in doing so, they completely rebranded the great prophet King Suleiman, you might know him as Solomon, not as a prophet of God, but as a powerful sorcerer who ruled through magic. But the Quran immediately pushes back hard on that idea to defend Suleiman's legacy. It states, very clearly, that it was not Solomon who disbelieved. Instead, it points the finger directly at the devils, calling them the true disbelievers and the actual source of this forbidden knowledge that they were teaching to mankind. So what exactly is this magic or sihr that we're talking about? The text defines it really simply. It's knowledge that harms people and brings them zero real benefit. It's framed as this purely corrupting, destructive force. Okay, this is where the story takes another fascinating turn. According to the source, two angels named Harut and Marut were sent down to Babylon, and they had a very unique mission: to serve as a divine test for humanity using this exact knowledge of magic.
And look, this wasn't some kind of hidden trap. The angels were completely upfront about it. To anyone who came to them wanting to learn, they gave this super direct warning: we are only a test, so do not disbelieve. The choice was laid out as clearly as it could possibly be.
And yet, despite that crystal clear warning from angels, the narrative says people made their choice. They actively chose to learn harmful magic, specifically spells to cause splits between husbands and wives. They were, in effect, trading the book of God for a book of spells and selling their souls in the process.
So when you put all these pieces together, you realize this whole dramatic story isn't just being presented as ancient history. It's being framed as a collection of timeless warnings, warnings for the future.
So, what are the big takeaways here? Well, the source is really emphasizing that messing with scripture and just blindly following corrupt leaders is a recipe for disaster. It argues that real faith is about your actions, not just wishful thinking. It also presents magic as this very real, very harmful temptation to be avoided at all costs. But ultimately, the whole story serves as one massive warning. Whatever you do, do not repeat the mistakes of the past.
And that kind of leaves us with a final, pretty heavy thought. If the story is warning us against blindly following leaders who might twist a message, it raises a question for any person of faith, anywhere, anytime. Where do you draw the line between following a sacred text and trusting the human beings who teach and interpret that text for you? It's a huge question this ancient story leaves us to think about today.